Hello and welcome to today's Virtual NZ. My name is Wendy Lucas and I'm a Program Director with the IBM Data Warehouse Marketing Team. We have another great topic today, getting the most from your Pure Data data warehouse, presented by one of our premier business partners, Aginity. We really try to keep our Virtual NZ topics at a practical, tips you can use, lots of practitioner level information to help you get the most from your systems. And today's topic, I think, does a great job of that. It's going to be more of a technical deep dive into Aginity's Workbench and solutions. Aginity is a leading big data and analytics services company, also providing enterprise software. And one key piece of software they developed a number of years ago is a free Workbench tool for Netezza systems. Some of you may be familiar with it and have used it. In today's call, Brian Weissler from Aginity is going to do a deeper dive into the Workbench, showing lots of practical examples and tips on how to get extra value from your system. If you caught our last month's Virtual NZ, we introduced in that call the concept of a free new capability in Pure Data called Fluid Query. Fluid Query allows you to run Hadoop queries from your Pure Data system and combine them with the data in your data warehouse for powerful analytic combinations. So Brian is also going to walk through some examples of Fluid Query from within the Workbench, including how you can use Fluid Query from within Aginity AMP, which is their analytic management platform solution. Brian is the Director of Product Management at Aginity. He's responsible for delivering the Workbench and Aginity AMP. He has worked in the data warehouse and analytics industry for his entire 17-year career, and he began as an engineer, joining Aginity in 2009 as a senior data architect and consulting on Netezza projects. So he's got a wealth of background and experience. When Aginity began working on AMP, Brian was the primary architect for the product and then ultimately took over product management. So with that, Brian, could we go to the next slide, and I'll just cover a couple of quick logistics. So before I officially pass it to Brian, just a couple notes. You can submit your questions via the Q&A button during Brian's presentation. We will be monitoring those, and we will have a Q&A session at the end of the presentation. And secondly, you can also download a copy of the presentation by clicking on the Content button. I would encourage you to do this, especially for today's presentation. Brian's got a lot of great detail and examples in his slides, so you might want to do that and have those handy. Depending on your display settings, you might want the ability to zoom in and see those up close, and certainly to have a copy after the presentation is over. So without any further delay, Brian, take it away.
Okay, thanks a lot, Wendy. This is Brian Weissler. Happy Friday. Thank you all very much for attending. Contrary to rumor, we are not actually giving away Apple Watches today. So if you showed up for that, hopefully you'll at least get some practical information out of this presentation. We are specifically going to talk about Aginity Workbench, which is our free MPP query tool. I will give a very brief introduction to our flagship product, Aginity AMP, which, as Wendy mentioned, is our analytic management platform, but we'll give you some practical advice there as well, and showing how you can use Fluid Query within Aginity AMP to bring your data in from Hadoop. We've got a lot of material to cover, and I'm going to talk pretty fast, but with the hopes of being able to get us to a Q&A at the end. And most of the slides, for the most part, present themselves, and they are downloadable, as Wendy mentioned. So here's what we're going to talk about in the flow. I'll give you a very, very brief intro into who Aginity is, and then we'll dive right into Workbench features. I tried to pack as many sort of favorite and seemingly hidden Workbench features into this presentation. We'll introduce or reintroduce Fluid Query and show how Workbench makes Fluid Query really easy to use. Briefly introduce AMP and show how you could use Fluid Query there. And then we'll give you a little sneak peek into some upcoming Workbench features, and then hopefully get to a Q&A. So Aginity started in 2005 as a big data and analytics services company, basically building data warehouses and software applications backed by Pure Data for analytics. And in 2009, our engineering team, headed by, and I believe he's with us, his name is Oleg, so some of you are Workbench users for many years now will probably know Oleg. Feel free to say hi, although nobody can hear you. And then what happened there was we developed Workbench for ourselves, for our own purposes, for querying Netezza and just making it easier to work with. And we made it freely available, and it was pretty quickly adopted by the Netezza community, and in fact became the first step for sales engineers in Netezza training. You know, literally step one says, hey, go download Workbench. So we've continued to build out that product, and it remains free and will remain free. A few years later, we took some of the additional sort of software capabilities that we had been developing for ourselves on our consulting projects and partnered with IBM to release a product called Customer Insight Appliance for Retail. That got some pretty good adoption, but in 2013 we actually rebranded it Aginity AMP and made it much more focused on analytic management and more generalized and generic from an industry perspective. So we are at this point pretty much completely an enterprise software provider. A sampling of some of our customers, as you can see below, actually a sampling of Aginity Workbench customers. You know, it spreads across all industries, basically anybody working with an MPP platform. And then, you know, Aginity AMP having come out in 2013, we've got some nice brands there that we're working with, and that's a sampling of the Aginity AMP customers. With that, I'd like to ask Mark if you could just post the first poll. So this one's pretty obvious and simple. Are you currently a Workbench user? There's a few different options here, so we'll wait a few seconds to let some answers come on in. Okay, I think we'll see the results now. All right, I like it. Not a whole lot to complain about there. Thank you guys for being users. So hopefully you're going to get quite a bit out of this session here, and if not, honestly, tell me why. Okay, we'll move on. We're going to jump into Workbench features, some powerful and favorite features here. So one of the advantages of you know, having released Workbench the way we did is it's just chock full of features, right? So you know, anything Oleg could think of, anything the team could think of, you know, kind of made its way into Workbench. The downside of that is you know, UX and documentation are, you know, a little bit behind, a little bit work in progress. So some of these features end up a little bit hidden. So we'll hopefully uncover some new ones for you. The first we're going to talk about here is database grouping and entity filters. So you know, on the left-hand side of the pane here is your object browser, and you know, when working with large systems, this could get cluttered. You have lots and lots of databases and tables and views and objects in there. And you can utilize two features, grouping and entity filters, independently or together, to help filter that down and focus on your particular projects. And so you can see right here, I've grouped these databases into three groupings: Netezza databases, AMP databases, and system databases. Everything else falls into uncategorized. And then we can also apply filters. So you can see here that the AMP grouping contains a database called AMP demo base, and there's 360 tables in there. Yet I filtered it down to the 14 that start with campaign. And I just bring this up to show that my good buddy Eli, who runs our support group here, he's been writing knowledge base articles, and this is one that he recently pushed out to actually show very specifically how you could utilize this feature. And you can find those knowledge bases out at support.aginity.com/forums. Zone maps. So because we purpose-built Workbench for Netezza, now pure data, we focused in on exposing features that are specific and powerful within those platforms. And so one example is, of course, Pure Data's secret sauce, the zone maps. So you can basically open up any table, and there's a bottom node there called zone maps. You simply click on that, and within one click, you can see which columns the table is well ordered by that you'll have zone maps on for passing predicates. This works for groomed CVTs as well. So if you have a cluster-based table and it's groomed, you'll see zone maps there. Okay, so the examples going forward are going to follow through a recent project that I worked on, just to give some context. This is going to help when we get to the Aginity AMP and the fluid query section as well. And I could have gone all big data on you guys, but honestly, you all know that with systems like Netezza, big data really just acts like data anyway. So I went off and pulled a recent project that I already had in my system, which was important to me and will help tell the story. I've been in my fantasy baseball league for 5 years now, never finished better than second place, and I hope to change that this year. So I stepped it up a little bit on the draft prep. And the approach that I wanted to take was to go ahead and make sure I drafted value. And for people who aren't familiar, drafting value basically just means finding players who are projected using projection algorithms to perform better than they are being drafted. So for example, if the Cincinnati speedster Billy Hamilton is projected to perform like a top 12 player, that's the first round, and I can wait and get him in the fourth round, I've drafted great value. And so the opposite of that is obviously overvaluing players and choosing somebody in the second or third round who's projected to act more like a 10th rounder. Sounds really simple. It's not as easy to do as it sounds. So I employed some data and Netezza and Workbench to help me through the process. So the examples you're going to see here, first thing we're going to talk about is importing from JSON. So we all know that you can use Workbench to import CSVs, text files, even Excel, etc. But you can also import from XML or JSON. So what I did right before the draft, I went out, I got some injury data, make sure I don't draft injured players or at least know when they're going to come back from injury. And this was in a JSON format, but that's no problem for Workbench because we just go through the import wizard and you can see that it flattens it out nicely for us and imports it as a table. Speaking of data import and CSVs and text files, again, being purpose-built for Pure Data, we can take advantage of some of the utilities they have, like external table imports. So a larger data set that I had, which is all of my projection data that I got from a respected site called Fangraphs. This is in a pretty straightforward CSV. So if you already have a table you've instantiated with DDL, you can basically go ahead and right-click on that table, import data, and what it's going to do is it's going to bring up a little form that pre-populates but also allows you to modify all of the options you have for building an external table. And you can go ahead and grab log information to drop that somewhere, your NZBAD and NZlog files. And you can either execute it directly from here or you can copy the SQL and paste it into a script that you can use later. Viewing table distribution. So similar to zone maps, one of the great advantages of Pure Data is its MPP, and so you want to make sure you distribute your data evenly. And so with a very simple right-click onto a table, you can show the distribution of a table. And this brings up this little chart. You can see I'm reasonably distributed. Could probably use a little bit of help, but it's a small table on a large system, so it's about as good as you could probably expect. But the nice thing about this is you can also see the deleted row counts. So you can see about 20% of my rows are deleted, and that's because I've gone and updated these projections throughout time. So you can see the red there, those are deleted rows. If you don't want to analyze one table at a time, but you want to analyze a schema or certain tables in a schema, you can do that from the Tools window, or the Tools menu, Analyze Database Schema. And this will give you an option to choose which tables you want to analyze. And here are your choices. You can look at foreign key data integrity, data types, need to reclaim, so those deleted rows, for example, and then table distribution. And this will return back to you all of this information on the tables that you've chosen to analyze. And the nice part about this as well is you can just take action directly from Workbench. So if I had a table that was poorly distributed and I wanted to change that distribution, I go ahead and right-click on the table and hit the Advanced menu. And there you can see I've got options for reclaiming or grooming, for changing the distribution, for changing the organize on if you want to create a cluster-based table or change the cluster-based table. You can reorder the data if you just want to get zone maps, analyze the table data, generate inserts, and drop the table directly from here. The query editor. Okay, so I've hidden the object browser, and this can be done with a simple Control or Command B. So that's been moved over to the left, and I'm looking straight at a query editor now. And one of the nice things I can do is I can use comments to create these collapsible regions. So I start it with a region comment, and then I can give it a label, and then end it with an end region. And that makes these now collapsible. So this is the script that I'm using to go ahead and start creating my rankings, my custom rankings based on projections for the draft. And you got an expanded region here, and you've got a collapsed region here. The other thing is you can change options, certain options, just for this particular query editor. So most of these options are available in the Tools Application Options section. But if I've got something I want to change just for this editor, I can do it right here. Things like the query timeout, the query kind, for example, ordinary SQL versus if I'm actually my script represents a stored procedure or a view and I want to retain formatting, I can change that query kind. Some other interesting ones, keep connection open between executions. So sometimes you've got temp tables that you're creating and you don't necessarily want to execute everything all at once. You want to do it step by step. If you keep connection open between executions in this query editor, your session will remain open and those temp tables will stick around. Continue on error allows you to, so basically Workbench will stop executing statements once one of them fails. But if you know that there's a chance something's going to fail, like you've got a drop table statement and you don't have it conditionalized in like a stored procedure or anything, you can choose to continue on error and it'll just keep running your scripts. Pre-execute script is interesting. This is something that'll execute prior to anything in the query editor. So if you're trying to do some kind of logging, for example, or in this case is an old thing that we used to do if we're doing some DML and we want to make sure we're in the right database, we'll simply do this sort of pre-execution script to check the current catalog, make sure it's what I think it is. And if not, then we'll fail by doing a divide by zero. Parameterized queries, one of my favorite features, and this is actually going to start to play into the Aginity AMP story as well. So what I'm doing here in this query is I'm actually starting to create my rankings. So I'm creating the inputs to my rankings, and what I'm doing here is following a pretty standard approach of assigning something called standings gain points. What that does is it basically tells me for each of the fantasy categories, wins, saves, strikeouts, etc. How many, how good do I have to be? Does a player have to be in order to move me up one position in the standings? Because we have to weigh all these categories against each other in order to draft the most balanced team, because that's how you win the league. And so you can see these little dollar signs here. These are parameters. And basically what this means is I'm gonna answer these parameters at runtime. Okay. So this is my saved query. I open it up and I'm going to go to run it. The reason why I might parameterize these is I might want to do some what if scenarios, for example. So if I took a wins standing gains points of 0.0024 from the history of some experts league, but now I want to actually plug in the history from my own league. I might want to balance those against each other. So this is it's not overly complicated math, but it's math, right? And these are algorithms that will want to both reuse and also be able to play what if scenarios against. From a parameter perspective, we have all the custom parameters, which once you create one, as soon as you hit a $sign, it'll bring up a list of all the custom ones you've entered so far. But you also get a bunch of really useful Workbench parameters. And these are things like, the error code returned back from a SQL statement, the rows affected, the database that you're connected to in the session. And so, you might leverage some of these if your script contains some logging, for example. You're going to write some log tables. But, here's the real juicy part about this, right? So what happens when I run this query is I get this box, and it allows me to fill in these parameters and go ahead and play with them, right? And so this is where I'm saving my math, if you will, but it's saved to this particular Workbench session. So the answers to these parameters exist only in this Workbench session. As soon as I close Workbench and then I open this query back up to run it again, I've got to answer these parameters again. But as long as I'm in Workbench, I can keep playing with these and running what-if scenarios. Okay, the advanced results grid. So once we went through the draft, I felt pretty good about my team. What I wanted to do is analyze using, obviously, my strategy, but analyze how I did from my strategy's perspective against the rest of my league. So I brought in the draft results from the rest of the league, and I ran a query to see how much value, according to my projections, these guys got based on their draft. And the nice thing about this is, yeah, you can see every row, but it might be nice to group some of this. So you can easily group these by dragging some of those columns up into that gray section right there, and you can group in, and you can also choose to perform certain summarizations right inside the results grid, and you basically create a little pivot table. So I've grouped by team and value direction, whether it's overvalued or undervalued a player. You can see that my team is highlighted there, and thank God I came out first. Considering I very explicitly utilized this particular strategy, and it's using my projections. If my projections hold, I have done the best in this draft. So a good friend of mine, in Theo we trust here. Yeah, he's a Cubs fan. He claims to draft value as well, and he did okay, 6th out of 12, again according to my projections and my rankings. Nice part is also, you can drill down on any of these, and you can see the detailed rows, as you can see here, and then you can see the interim summaries. So this is now broken by my second grouping direction, so you can see my players that I overvalued, and these tend to be relief pitchers and some of my sleepers. So Nathan Eovaldi, I'm a Yankee fan. I watched him in spring training. I think he's going to be real good, so I overreached for him a little. But you can see overwhelmingly I drafted value, and I did manage to get Billy Hamilton, and I got him in the 4th round. Other nice thing you could do with advanced results grid, you can pop up a little chart, and this is a frequency distribution chart, and you can create custom groupings like I did here to go ahead and set cutoffs for that distribution. So it's not quite Excel, but it's a nice starting point if you don't want to bring the data into Excel. And of course, from the results grid, you could always just right-click Export to Excel, and it takes you right there. UDX development starts to get pretty geeky. So those of us who have taken real advantage of Netezza and Pure Data for a long time and have kind of really leveraged it throughout enterprise applications and solutions, we're going to do some UDX development. And Workbench helps you out if you're doing C++ UDX development. We'll go ahead and create stubs for you. And the real nice part about this is we make it pretty easy to go ahead and compile and register your UDXs with a simple F7 or F5. And if you go F5, you also get this nice test query that we build for you and execute for you as well. You can see this test is executed, and all this is doing is returning back a randomized GUID. Code snippets are a pretty cool one and pretty well hidden. So if you go to Tools, Application Options, and then Code Snippets, this is where you can store hard to remember but often used pieces of code. So one of the things that I use, as you can see in this example, is sometimes you want to look at your deleted rows, right? And I never ever remember the syntax. It's like the easiest syntax in the world, but for whatever reason, I've got a brain block on it. So I save it as a snippet, and what happens there is when I go into my query editor, all I got to do is type the snippet shortcut, TX in this case, because that's what I've named it. Hit Alt-C, and I'm going to go ahead, and now it's going to put that code right in my query editor, and I can run it. And of course, I use my favorite feature, parameters. You can certainly parameterize a code snippet. And in this case, I parameterize the table name. So select, create transaction ID, delete transaction ID star from parameterized table name. And of course, there's the results, and you can see my deleted rows. All right. Fluid query. So those of you who were here last month were introduced to fluid query, so bear with me, but we're going to do this pretty quickly. Fluid query is, as Wendy mentioned, a free feature that was delivered last month by IBM. You can go and you can download it and install it pretty easily. And what it does is it allows you to essentially do two things. One is move data back and forth between Pure Data and Hadoop. And the other is, through a SQL interface, you can go ahead and basically federate queries from Pure Data to Hadoop. And this just shows how that can be done. There's the data movement side of things. This can be invoked either from the Hadoop cluster itself or from the NPS system itself. Or you can run Hadoop queries from using SQL and basically user-defined table functions. And it supports IBM's Big Insights, obviously. It supports CDH, and it also supports Horton Data Platform. So what we did with Workbench for working with Fluid is the first thing we do is go and find and expose all of your Fluid query functions. Otherwise, they're sort of arbitrarily named functions that you gave names to when you compiled and registered them. So we go and find your functions. What you're looking at here are our functions, which we sort of strategically named Fluid query read, and we've got a Big Insights over Big SQL, a Big Insights over Hive, a Horton over Hive, a Cloudera over Hive, and then a Cloudera over Impala. So those are all the things that Fluid supports. And then what's nice is you can actually see all of the metadata. So you can drill through this and see your Big SQL, Hive, and Impala objects, obviously depending on your connection that you've made. And you can use those to drag and drop and build your query so that you're not fumbling around with UDTF syntax. And of course, you can parameterize those queries. So in this case, we're selecting records from a Fangraphs hitters table that's actually in Hadoop. In this case, I believe it's in Impala. Yep. And we're pulling players where they've got a war greater than or equal to 1. All right, I'm going to give a very brief introduction to Aginity AMP. I'm not going to do a sales pitch at all. We're going to give you some practical use of this and contrast it a little bit against what we did using Workbench with that math and the stored parameters. Okay, so a little bit about the motivation behind why Aginity developed Aginity AMP. And it comes down to this. Aginity believes that a company's analytics are its most valuable asset. We believe they should be created once and used many times by many users and applications. Authors of algorithms shouldn't spend most of their time preparing data. Analytics should be cataloged and they should be searchable. They should be building blocks for other analytics. They should be self-served and easily distributed. And there should be one version of each analytic anywhere in the enterprise. These should not contradict each other. And when we talk analytics in Aginity AMP, we're specifically referring to the math that makes up those analytics. So in our example, it's those standing gains points calculations and the rankings. And what we're actually going to do here is I'd like to ask that the second and final poll get pushed out, Mark, if you don't mind. So the question is, where does your enterprise store math, right? So, you know, is the math within your enterprise or your analytics stored in SQL scripts, in ETL, business applications, or statistical modeling applications, or just somewhere else? All right, let's go ahead and grab the results so that we can continue moving on here. A lot in SQL scripts, a lot of ETL. All right, pretty spread across the board. Okay, thank you. Very useful info. Appreciate it. All right, so let's move on. All right, so to describe very briefly in one slide Aginity AMP, we say that you can use Aginity AMP to build your analytic warehouse. And what this is where your data, your source data, come together with your math. So the data sources contribute the data to the system, your analysts contribute the math to the system, and then AMP stores both and feeds them to any application, and it does so by manifesting them as attributes, dimensional attributes. So you can think of the results of the math being delivered as columns on a table or fields on a file. AMP runs on top of an MPP database, currently Pure Data, and next week we're actually releasing a beta version of this that will run on DashDB, which is IBM's cloud data warehouse service. And so this is where your enterprise data and math come together and then get published as attributes to any application. And we've got a really nice quote here from our partners over at Catalina Marketing. Dak, the Chief Data Officer there, was kind enough to provide us with this quote. Catalina, who has one of the world's biggest consumer databases, has bought Aginity software, specifically Aginity AMP, to scale our global analytics capabilities. All right. So now we're going to show you how you can use AMP with Fluid Query. So this is AMP. This is the AMP integrated development environment. Looks a little bit different than Workbench, but should be kind of a familiar UI here. And what we do is we define sources inside of AMP, and you can see that on the left-hand side here. Sources are typically landed PDA tables, reasonably raw tables landed in PDA. But in this case, we're actually defining our source as a Fluid Query UDTF call. You can see I'm doing a select star from Fangraphs hitters. I could obviously drop a where clause in there if this is something that's going to run sort of daily or what have you. What we can do once the source is defined is we can actually profile the data while it's still inside of Hadoop. And we do this right inside of AMP. We're going to profile some of the columns that we're going to use in our attribute math. So one of the categories in my league is home runs, obviously. So we want to make sure that the home run data look good, that we've got a decent distribution, it looks reasonable, and you can see that we do. We'll profile some more data. These are profiling now string columns, the player team, and you can see that we can see the top values there in the profile. Remember, the data are still in Hadoop. They have not yet been moved to PDA. And finally, because we're going to load this into our system as a dimension, we're going to need a primary key. What we want to do is profile the natural key column to make sure that it is distinct, so we don't load dupes. And it looks pretty good. So now that I feel pretty good about our source definition, we can load it into the analytic warehouse from Hadoop using our loading wizard. And so this is just a step-by-step wizard. You can see we're going to load a subject area called Fangraphs, a dimension called hitters. We're going to map all of the source columns except for zips rank because I'm actually going to apply my own ranking. We do that with a single click. We choose our natural key column. Because we are always building type 2 dimensions with AMP, we give you the opportunity to provide a source timestamp. Otherwise, we use the current timestamp. And you can actually even create foreign key relationships to other dimensions if you're snowflaking. Generate the mapping, and we can save it in our AMP metadata in case we want to run it again later or schedule it. Now, once the data has been loaded into AMP, we can use AMP's form-based attribute workbench to author and catalog our standings gain points math. Okay, so all that math that was in my SQL script, my parameterized SQL script before, you know, which was usable only by me, is now going to be stored here and able to be shared. And so this is our attribute workbench. And you can see on the left-hand side, what I'm doing is calculating each of the components so each of the categories, so batting average, home runs, RBIs, runs, and stolen bases, that I'm ultimately going to use to create a total standings gain points. And what I do here is I come on in and I can easily search for all of the attributes that I loaded from Hadoop. And you can see in the batting average, standing gains points, it's a formula. And I just pop hits and at-bats in there, which I've searched for and found easily. And then I pop my assumptions in there. Then what I can do is I can take each of those 5 and I can reuse them as building blocks to build my total standing gains points. So here I've used the new derived attributes as building blocks to create the total. And the big part about this is this math is now stored here in AMP's metadata and can be consistently leveraged by all AMP users and consuming applications. It's not just trapped in my desktop. So the last thing that I can do, if I'm one of those all AMP users, is I can come in and I can publish this information as a dimensional attribute. And so the first thing I can do is come into Attribute Workbench as a user, and I can on-demand profile. Same way we profiled the source data, I can profile this attribute itself. Now remember, this is not a physical attribute, it's just math, right? We just stored the algorithm. And I go ahead and profile it, and I can see my total standing gains points, and I can see a nice curve that I would expect. And what can I do from there is I can publish this and other derived attributes alongside base attributes that I loaded from Hadoop. I can publish them together. And we do that using our publication wizard. I go ahead and I choose, you can see I've chosen 3 columns that were just source columns that I loaded, first name, last name, and team. I published my derived attribute that I created, the total hitter standings gain points. And I also created an expression right here which ranks all of the hitters based on the total standing gains points. And my output table, which I could filter if I wanted to. Again, I can save the mapping for later and also execute it immediately, which is what I do. When I do execute this, you can see that we produced a table called ranked hitters with 1,135 rows. It was successful, and this is what the table looks like. So I've published my 3 columns that I got from Hadoop, my calculated total hitter standing gains points, and this was a pretty simple scalar function. We can also do complicated functions, aggregates, we can do transforms, we can put conditions on these. So there's lots of things you can do, but this was a very simple example. And the key here really is to show how the math gets stored and can be easily reused throughout the enterprise. And there's our final ranking. So this was my final ranking that I went into my draft with. All right, enough AMP, back to Workbench. So looking ahead, so features that are going to be upcoming in the next couple releases here. First is detached windows. This is super sexy, I know, but incredibly practical. So if you work on multiple screens, as many of us do these days, now you'll be able to detach each Workbench screen that you're working on and move them around your multiple desktops. Split screens, so you could take your editor and you can split it horizontally, vertically, or 4 ways. I guess if you have 4 eyes. Object search. This one's been requested by many people. And what basically allows you to do is search patterns and search all the databases in your system, and go ahead and find objects, tables, views, stored procedures, whatever it is, show the results, and simply navigate to those entities or utilize context menus for those entities. And finally, very cool function and procedure auto-completion. So you can see here we've got a table function. This is actually our fluid query function. And what will happen is when you go into the parentheses there, you'll be able to scroll through all of the overloads. So you can see there's 4 overloads here. And I've scrolled into the second one. And as I type, very similar to Excel or Google Sheets, this tooltip is going to follow me along. So you can see I'm currently in the 3rd parameter where I should be providing a string. And finally, we did have to address the big yellow elephant in the room, in that we're going to be introducing Aginity Workbench for Hadoop. This will be coming first in June with initial support for Big SQL and Hive. And then we will be adding support of other execution engines as we move along here and as this product starts to gain success and adoption. Here is a quick screen from our current beta version. It's in a very, very limited beta right now until June. And as you can see, you can connect through the interface that you're comfortable with Workbench, and you can use native syntax. So in this case, this is Big SQL syntax. So it's a Big SQL connection, and I'm using Big SQL syntax. The other nice thing, if you're using Big SQL, for example, is you have the ability to leverage nicknames, which are essentially federated queries, right? So they're remote table connections or table definitions. The less interesting thing about nicknames is you don't get a whole heck of a lot of metadata about them. You really just get their name. So what we've done is we've added this linked servers node, which actually, very similar to what we did with Fluid Query, will allow you to drill into those linked servers or those remote servers and view all of the metadata, tables, columns, etc. All right, if you want more info, here's how you can get it. And to do a quick recap and contrast between Aginity Workbench and Aginity AMP. So Workbench is our free mp4 query application. And AMP is our enterprise analytic management platform. While Workbench is free and continues to be free, Aginity AMP, not so much. Usually comes in a 1 to 3 year subscription. You can get Workbench by simply going to aginity.com Workbench and downloading it. And we've got multiple versions of it, including a version for DB if you're using DB. If you want to learn more about Aginity AMP, go ahead and contact us. Contact me directly, or go ahead and email solutions@aginity.com. From a support perspective, currently Workbench, the support is the forums and the standard support that you get. For Aginity AMP, you get standard or premium support as well as consulting services. We are actually considering a premium support option for Workbench, as that's been requested by some folks. And then there's some helpful links here for you. And if anybody was actually following along with the whole fantasy baseball story, and I didn't lose you on that, and you care, here's how it wrapped up. Here's my team. I'm currently in 4th place, although the season is very early, and there's 12 teams in the league, so I feel pretty good. I've got 3 guys on the DL, at least one of which should be able to come back and help me out. If you have any interest in how this shook out for me, feel free to find me on LinkedIn or ping me otherwise, and I'll tell you whether I finished first or last or somewhere in between. So that's it from my side. Punt it back over to Wendy to go ahead and kick off any Q&A.
Thanks, Brian. That was great. I have to be honest, I don't know whether to be more impressed at the features within the Workbench or your ability to use analytics for the baseball statistics. That was an interesting example to go through the functionality in the Workbench. I'm also surprised to hear that you're in 4th place, but like you said, it's early in the season, and I wouldn't be surprised with all of the data you use to make your decisions that we'll hopefully hear from you later in the season that you finished at the top of the charts.
I hope so. Super early this season.
That was a great example. Okay, we'll go ahead and take some questions, and a few of these I think I would categorize as requests for enhancements, and we can go through those. First question, when are you going to include all on the drop-down list of schemas when issuing a grant command? Currently, all is available only on the NZ host.
I can't say that this has actually hit my radar yet. So what I would suggest, honestly, is to go ahead and submit this to WB support@aginity.com. That'll hit our ticketing system. and you'll be able to provide whatever details you'd like, and that's the best way to get this feature on our radar and into our queue. I wish I had a better answer for you right now on this one, but I don't. But we can certainly get you one if you go ahead and hit us at wbsupport@aginity.com.
Yeah, that's great feedback. Thanks for that. Next question: what version of MPS are you using, or I guess maybe more generally, can you speak to the any version considerations between MPS and the Workbench?
Sure. So, I mean, Workbench has been available actually going as far back as Mustang. So, we use it for everything. We test, certainly we test AMP. It is certified on 7.0 versions, 7.1 and 7.2. So we haven't really hit too many hiccups with respect to AMP, and Workbench certainly we haven't really hit any challenges with specific versions of NPS, and so they work across at this point certainly TwinFin, Striper, and Mako. We did have one little issue on Striper with respect to and Mako with the way we were reporting data slices in the data distribution. But we fixed that, and that'll be fixed and delivered with the next release.
Okay, great. Next question: the query timeout option setting cannot override the query timeout settings set on the database. Is that correct?
That's correct. Right. You'd have to have permissions to alter the user session in order to do that. So this really just changed the timeout of Workbench itself.
Okay, great. Next question: is the error code sent back the one that Netezza sends back, or is it the one created by Aginity?
Yeah, so we send back what we get back from Netezza for the most part. We try to do very, very little interpretation, and I know there's been complaints that it gets cut off, and we take what the driver gives us, unfortunately.
Okay. Is there a way to export and share code snippets? Coworkers have asked if they can be shared.
Hi, Marie. There probably is. I honestly, this hasn't really come up yet, but I will absolutely get you an answer on this. I think what we'll do is we'll have Eli post a forum on how that could be done. My guess is it's going and grabbing something from registry. But if I'm speaking out of turn and it's not actually doable, I completely apologize. But I believe we'll find a way, and we'll post something up on the forum.
Okay, that's good. We'll follow up on that. Next question: to run a block of code like a stored procedure, we need to hit Control F5. Do we have any setting to avoid that and run block with F5? And is this an Netezza issue or an Aginity issue?
So you do have this ability within Aginity, and the way that I showed it, actually, if I can move this out of the way and get back really quickly to the one slide, is with the options. It's right here. So in your query editor, there's a little options button right there, and you can bring up query options. So query kind right here, ordinary SQL. If you were to change that to SP/view, then you are now in a procedure editor, and you can go ahead and just hit F5.
Okay. Great. Next question. Can you expand on how to set up the connection to Cloudera and Pala for fluid query with Aginity?
Okay, so it's not actually something that Aginity helps with. So once you have the function registered, we provide all this great information. But registering the function is something that is done on the NPS host. There's actually really, really good instructions. If you don't have the Fluid Query user guide, I would recommend you go get it from Fix Central. and utilize it. Our IT folks had a pretty easy time deploying this stuff. And there were some tricks around the Impala side, but mostly those were things that needed to be fixed on our end. So I would say go and get that Fluid Query user guide, and if you have any trouble, the developer works forum over on Netezza is a good place to get questions answered for that type of stuff. If you do have trouble, you can email us and we could try and help you out. But that's really a pure data thing more so than an Aginity thing.
Okay. Can AMP connect to or use all other types of databases such as Oracle, SQL Server, Hive, Access?
Okay. So AMP currently runs on Pure Data and will be running on Dash very soon. And what we do is we actually have you design your metadata and then bring the data into that particular system, onto that particular platform. And that is really from a performance perspective. There is some federation of the ability to create derived attributes using Hive QL. But it's really more of the exception than the rule. So because we generate all of the code based on the metadata and the math that you've put in there, we tend to control or want the data on the MPP platform. Okay, we are going to be expanding to other MPP platforms as well, and that does include Hadoop. So we're not there yet,
okay,
but we will be there shortly.
Okay. Will we be getting a select or a select all at any point for the SQL window portion?
I'm not sure I totally understand the question, but you can, on any given table, you can right-click on that table, and there's a script. So if you right-click and choose script, that opens another menu. And that menu does include a number of DML and DDL options, one of which is in fact select. And that will basically populate your query window or your clipboard with a select and then a listing of all the columns and then a from on that table. So hopefully that answers the question.
Is there a way to save queries and execute them automatically at a later time? Using SAS and SSIS, we can create bat files to execute scripts, then schedule them to run at a set time or run recurrently. Is this functionality available in Workbench?
It actually is, and I didn't show it. It's a little complicated and it's not often used. But actually, in our help. So at the end of this presentation, there is a link to the documentation, and actually in there is a link to the documentation. In our documentation is a feature called Command Line Builder, and so go ahead and check that out. And what that's going to do is it's going to do exactly that. It's going to build a bat file that you could go ahead and execute. So give that a shot, and hopefully that will do what you need it to do.
Okay. There is an option for View or SP. Could you explain more about that option? Is it found under the query options in the current Workbench?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So this alludes to the question that was asked earlier about having to hit Control F5 if you're running, trying to compile a stored procedure or a view, and so basically it just changes the editor type so that the plain SQL editor will execute statements one at a time, and that's basically up until it finds a semicolon. Well, obviously you're going to have lots of semicolons inside of a stored procedure, so you want to, when you hit F5, you want the whole window to be grabbed and submitted at once, and so that's what that does. It also retains the formatting, so that when you reverse engineer your stored procedure or your view, your formatting has been retained.
Okay. Will Aginity have the ability to auto-export to a file after query execution, similar to the export to in DB2?
You actually can already. So if you go to Query the query menu in the toolbar, one of the options is execute to file. And that'll allow you to do just that. It'll write the output directly to a file, and you have a choice to include headers if you want as well, I believe.
Okay, great. Is Aginity for Hadoop, you mentioned that coming in June, Brian, is Aginity for Hadoop also going to be free?
It is, yes.
Great news. Thank you. Someone who's interested in getting a beta copy of AMP, is there somewhere they could turn in some of these other links, Brian, or what would you recommend for any beta program options?
Yeah, so we don't currently do betas. We have on occasions done proofs of concept, but you know, I mean, it can be a fairly engaged, heavily engaged sales cycle. So I would say that if you are in any way interested in AMP or even just learning a little bit more about it, you can visit our website on it, and you can also email solutions@aginity.com, and we'll be certain to engage you on that.
Okay. Are there any plans to integrate Aginity with Amazon Redshift? Common question.
So I'm not sure exactly what the question means with respect to integrate, but there is actually an Aginity workbench for Amazon Redshift. So if you go to aginity.com/workbench, you'll see the platforms we support, and one of them is in fact Redshift. And that's actually gotten some pretty good adoption since we put it out last year. So hopefully that answers the question.
Okay. Another specific question about the interface, are you going to provide formatting for views similar to the formatting for stored procs so that they don't show as a single line?
I'm actually curious as to what is said here. So the formatting we do when we retain it through when you create the view or the procedure through Workbench. If you have it and you've compiled it in another way, we don't attempt to format it for you. So if you've created a view using Workbench and you've done it using the view, the SP/view editor type or editor kind, and you're not seeing that view reverse engineered formatted, then go ahead and submit that as a bug.
Okay. Yeah, we can look at that and follow up. Okay, with that, we are unfortunately at the end of our time. There were just a few more questions that we didn't quite get to, so if we didn't get to your question, we will certainly get back to you with your contact information. And just to wrap up, there's some information here at the end of the presentation, some additional links to information on Pure Data, some of the other things that we referenced. Certainly, I would encourage you, if you're not an active member of the NZ community, a great place for sharing of information, getting questions answered. There's a very active forum on that online site, so I would encourage you to join, to look there. And also, feel free to check back in our virtual briefing center for some of our previous topics. Any suggestions you have for future topics, things you'd like to see on Virtual NZ, we're always open to hearing those. So with that, I want to thank everybody for joining. Brian, I really want to thank you for your time and the informative view into the Workbench and AMP. It was very helpful. And with that, everybody go ahead and have a great day.